Julian Hart had always preferred machines to people. Tucked away at the edge of a dying human colony, surrounded by half-collapsed buildings and old-world tech, he found comfort in logic, wires, and silence. The other kids mocked him, called him junk rat or dead signal. He didn't care. The machines didn't lie, didn't judge, didn't hurt. That day began like the others. He'd woken before sunrise, slipped through the outer perimeter, and made his way to the overgrown ruins of what used to be a research facility. Most thought it was just another husk left behind after the corporate retreat, but Julian knew the place had layers. Stories whispered in old data logs and forgotten terminals. Something had happened here, something deliberately erased. His boots crunched over cracked tile and vines as he entered the half-buried west wing. It smelled of rust and stale air. The deeper he went, the more nature reclaimed. Moss grew over steel panels, and thick roots burst through what used to be reinforced concrete. His scanner blinked lazily, no power signatures, no movement. As he turned the corner toward the sublab, a faint noise stopped him. A whimper. Soft. Fragile. Guttural. Alien. He froze. Listened again. There it was, barely audible, but there. It wasn't mechanical. Organic. He tightened his grip on his stun stick and stepped forward slowly. What he found made his breath catch. In a caved-in chamber, half filled with dirt and fallen support beams, lay a creature. It was small, roughly the size of a large dog, but leaner, with silver-gray fur streaked with dried blood. Its limbs were bound by a chain that looped around a broken post. The collar around its neck was thick, metallic, and fused to its skin. Its eyes opened at his approach, piercing, electric blue with slit pupils, and it growled, low and defensive, but too weak to lift its head. Its ribs jutted beneath its fur. Flies buzzed around wounds on its flank. It had been there for days. Maybe longer. Julian's gut twisted. It wasn't just that someone had left it there. It was the way they had. No food, no water. They hadn't just abandoned it, they'd meant for it to die. He took a slow step forward. "Hey," he whispered, voice barely audible over the creaking metal around them. "I'm not here to hurt you." The growl deepened. Its body tensed, though it didn't have the strength to move. He crouched low, keeping his hands visible, and set his pack down. From it, he pulled a protein bar, unwrapped it halfway, and slid it across the floor. The creature stared at it, unmoving. Julian sat back on his heels. "I don't know what you eat, but it's all I've got." Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the alien sniffed the air. It pulled the bar toward itself with one paw and sniffed again. Cautiously it bit into it, tiny, testing nibbles. A shudder ran through its body. Hunger. Julian exhaled. "Yeah. Thought so." He pulled a water pouch from his belt and unscrewed the cap. Edging closer, he tipped a bit into a cracked plastic lid and set it down. The creature licked its lips and drank. He stayed there for nearly an hour, watching. Observing. Talking softly. The creature never fully relaxed, but it didn't lash out either. It kept its eyes on him, wary, but curious. Eventually, Julian scooted closer to the base of the post. The chain was thick, reinforced alloy. Not something an animal would break. Definitely military grade. He leaned in to examine the collar, fingers brushing dirt from the metal. That's when he saw it, words, barely visible under grime. He wiped them clean. Subject 47, terminate on recovery. The world narrowed. His pulse surged. This wasn't a random alien. This was part of a program. Something created, labeled, discarded. Someone had brought it here, locked it up, and walked away like it was garbage. The creature let out a soft whine and lowered its head. Not submission. Resignation. Julian's stomach churned. Whoever did this didn't just hate it, they feared it. Enough to make sure no one ever found it again. He looked at the chain, then back at those glowing blue eyes. "No," he muttered. "Not like this." From his pack, he pulled a multi-tool and sparked up the cutting torch. The creature flinched but didn't move. He braced the collar, put the torch to the joint, and started slicing. He didn't know what he was doing. But he knew what he wasn't doing. He wasn't walking away. Julian returned the next morning with gauze, antiseptic, and more food. The alien creature, Vex, as he'd started calling it in his mind, was still alive barely. The protein bar had been eaten down to the wrapper. Its eyes tracked him, weaker than before, but alert. It didn't growl this time. He knelt by the broken post and pulled the med kit from his bag. "This'll sting," he said, not expecting understanding. Vex didn't react when Julian cleaned the wound along its ribs, just winced slightly as the alcohol touched raw flesh. The fur was matted with blood and dirt. Julian worked in silence, methodically patching up what he could. Vex stayed still. By the fourth visit, something shifted. Julian whistled the same soft note every time he approached. Vex began to respond, not just by opening its eyes, but with a low, almost melodic hum in reply. It had learned the pattern. Trusted it. Julian noticed more. The creature's gaze wasn't animalistic. It wasn't just reacting to hunger or pain. It was watching him, measuring, learning. It recognized his tools. Watched how he used them. When he pulled out a broken data slate and began working on a portable scanner, Vex tilted its head, then extended a claw to mimic the motion. Julian paused. He laid out small pieces of wire, microchips, scraps from a fried interface. Vex nudged one piece with a paw, pushing it into a familiar slot. Correctly. "You're not just smart," Julian whispered. "You remember." The collar had left scars on Vex's neck. Julian analyzed it back at home. Standard military-grade neural suppression device. Not designed for animals. Designed for cognitive beings. Creatures with thoughts, memory, identity. What kind of program chains up something this advanced and calls it a subject? Vex was recovering faster than he'd expected. The limp remained, but it was no longer skeletal. It moved when he approached, ears twitching, body poised, not in fear but readiness. Julian began feeding it cooked meat. The creature responded better, more animated. Its fur began to smooth out, shimmer faintly under the low light, and the whimpering stopped completely. He started talking to it, not just casually, but deliberately. Names of tools. Terms from old textbooks. The word. Water. Food. "Julian," Vex responded. Not with words, but with gestures. When he said, "Julian," it tapped his chest. When he said, "Water," it moved toward the canteen. It was forming associations. One evening, while Julian was repairing a broken drone shell, Vex scratched something into the dirt with its claw. A rough triangle. Then a circle beneath it. He didn't understand until it tapped its own chest, then repeated the symbol. "This is you?" Julian asked. The creature stared. Then tapped the circle again. He crouched down and copied it into his notepad. "All right. Vex," he said. "That's your name." It blinked slowly, not resisting. Days bled into weeks. Julian kept Vex hidden in an abandoned storage shed deep in the ruins. He rigged solar panels for light and heat, built a water purifier from scavenged parts, and set up cameras to watch for movement. It wasn't just protection, it was habit. He wanted to understand everything: how Vex slept, what sounds it made, what made it flinch. There was a pattern, routine behavior that suggested prior conditioning. Every time a loud, sharp tone rang from Julian's equipment, Vex would jerk and lower its head. Punishment training. Someone had used sound to control it. Julian reprogrammed his devices to avoid the frequency. It took time, but the flinching stopped. The collar was still half buried under vines. Julian had left it there, didn't want to keep it near Vex. But part of him studied it anyway. He matched the serial number against old corporate databases. One match, a program marked classified, tied to an exogenetic enhancement division that had quietly gone dark 5 years ago. The facility they were in wasn't just a lab, it had been a testing site. One night, Julian woke to a flicker on his wrist pad. Movement. Camera 4 had detected heat signatures, 3 men, armed, sweeping through the southern ruins. Not scavengers. Military posture. Tactical formation. He watched as they paused, scanned the area, then moved toward the deeper vaults. They were searching. Not for scrap. For something alive. He looked at Vex, now curled beside the heater, breathing steadily. Still healing. Still trusting. Julian turned off the lights. No sleep that night. He sat with the stun baton gripped in his lap, back against the wall, watching the feed as the men disappeared into the dark. Vex stirred and pressed its head lightly to Julian's leg. He didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on the screen, jaw clenched, the weight of what he was protecting finally setting in. Julian stayed underground for 2 days after spotting the armed search team. They moved methodically, combing the ruins, scanning for biosigns. He disabled all automated systems, rerouted power, and masked their heat signature using a salvaged field scrambler. Vex didn't make a sound, as if it understood the stakes. Every hour they went undetected felt like borrowed time. Once the sensors cleared, Julian returned to the central lab. He needed answers, real ones. He used an old administrator override to access a sealed terminal, bypassing corrupted files until he found the locked archive labeled Project Agaron. Inside were logs, genetic blueprints, and operation orders. Vex hadn't been born. It had been engineered, part of a classified program to develop sentient tactical organisms. Hybrid constructs capable of memory retention, emotional bonding, and adaptive combat behavior. Biological weapons disguised as companions. They called them biointegrated units. Not test subjects. Not animals. Assets. Vex was one of 7. All tagged. All programmed to bond with a human controller through neurological imprinting. Early reports praised their success, intelligence, reflexes, loyalty. But something went wrong. One bonded unit had refused an order during a combat simulation. It had shielded its handler from a drone strike, deviating from mission protocol. Command viewed it as a failure. The result was termination of the project. All remaining subjects were decommissioned. Burned. Scrapped. Or dumped. Vex survived by accident. Julian leaned back, fists clenched. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They'd created something capable of love, of choice, and tried to erase it when it stopped being obedient. Not because it failed. Because it cared. He copied the files to his pad. This wasn't just a pet. Vex was living proof of something the corporations didn't want exposed. Back in the shelter, Vex was pacing. Its eyes darted to Julian's face, then to his datapad. Julian knelt, held it out. "I know what you are," he said. "They made you. And they tried to kill you for being more than a weapon." Vex didn't react at first. Then it placed a paw on the screen, claws tapping a folder name. It knew. Julian paused. "You remember it?" Vex nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then its eyes glazed over. Seconds later, Julian's wrist pad lit up with interference, followed by a flicker of static. He felt pressure in his skull, not painful, just strange. His vision blurred. And then it wasn't his anymore. He saw white walls. Cold floors. Sterile light. Voices shouting. Pain radiating through a metal collar. Then warmth, brief, gentle. A hand? A boy, maybe 10. The only one who spoke softly. Vex remembered his name. He was gone now. Then the memory changed. Fire. Screaming. A sealed chamber filling with gas. Other units collapsing. Doors slamming shut. The sound of laughter, human, cruel, and final. Then darkness. Julian gasped and stumbled back. The vision ended. Vex stared at him, waiting. Julian's hands shook. "You showed me." It wasn't just memory. It was a cry for acknowledgement. A truth buried under silence. "They'll come back," Julian said. "When they realize you're still alive." Vex growled low, a sound Julian hadn't heard since the first day. "No," he said firmly. "You don't run this time." Julian packed the documents, encrypted the footage, and uploaded fragments to 3 independent relay towers. He activated a passive data leak protocol. If anything happened to him, everything would go public. That night he began prepping for departure. Rations, tools, weapons. He couldn't stay hidden forever, but he could choose where to be found. Vex sat near the exit, alert, sensing the shift in mood. Julian had a plan: head north, past the collapsed ridge, into the wild zones where no patrols ventured. Dangerous, yes, but isolated. Remote enough to disappear. Or fight, if it came to that. He didn't ask Vex to follow. But when he opened the bunker's rusted door at dawn, Vex was already beside him. They moved quickly through broken terrain. Julian's sensor pinged once, brief, sharp, someone scanning from a drone, far behind. Vex stopped suddenly near a fallen comm tower. Its body tensed. Julian followed its gaze: scorch marks, shallow graves, debris. The site of the termination. Vex crouched, pressed its nose to the ground, then looked up at Julian. Not with fear. With certainty. They weren't just surviving now. They were going to be seen. The wild zones were chaos incarnate: electromagnetic storms, ruined satellites half fused into rock, mutant fauna shaped by chemical runoffs. Julian navigated it with calculated risk, using old cartographic overlays stitched from black market data. Most of it was inaccurate, but he relied on instinct and Vex's heightened senses. They moved silently, carefully. Vex scouted ahead, reading scents and vibrations, often halting Julian before he even sensed danger. There was no hesitation in their rhythm anymore, only trust. At night, under makeshift camo tents powered by scrap solar nodes, Julian reviewed the data he had stolen. Fragments of video logs, audio transcripts, genetic maps, each one a confirmation of how deep the cover-up went. The Agaron project had extended beyond mere weapons testing. There were implications that the units, Vex and others, had been tested for human psychological bonding under duress. Love, loyalty, grief, all induced, then measured. One audio log hit harder than the rest. A woman's voice, trembling. Subject 47 responded to the loss of Handler M with prolonged mourning behaviors. It refused food. Attempted to revive the body. We were ordered to incinerate him in front of the unit. It screamed for hours. Not noise. Not instinct. It knew. Julian didn't sleep that night. He simply sat, back to a cold wall, with Vex resting at his side. The stars above blinked faintly through the clouded atmosphere. Somewhere in the sky, satellites still orbited, full of silent data. None of them told this story. By the 5th day in the wild zone, they found a Berry node hub, one of the old world's encrypted transmission centers. Still offline, but intact. Julian set up a modified pulse relay to broadcast a narrow-band signal. It wasn't meant to call for help. It was bait. He encoded the Agaron files into the signal, disguised as a routine diagnostic packet. If the corporate watchdogs were still scanning dormant networks, they'd see the file. They'd come for it. And if they didn't? Someone else eventually would. Vex stayed close but agitated. It sensed something approaching. Julian double-checked the sensor net he had deployed, motion detectors and seismic monitors stitched together with outdated firmware. He noticed irregularities, fluctuations too precise to be environmental. A pattern. He reviewed the logs and confirmed it. There were pulse gaps every 37 minutes, exact intervals. Someone was disrupting the feed manually. Cloaked movement. Tactical pacing. Julian didn't panic. He adapted. He set the node hub to overload in case of breach. If they found it, the evidence would destroy itself. He encrypted a backup copy and embedded it in Vex's neural array. The process was risky, untested on non-human interfaces, but the Agaron framework had made Vex's brain partially synthetic. It could handle the load. As the last block transferred, Julian looked into Vex's eyes. "This makes you the only one who remembers." Vex didn't blink. Hours later, the sky shimmered unnaturally, distortion from a stealth craft descending without sound. Julian crouched beneath the canopy and watched the grass flatten in a perfect circle. They had arrived. No insignia. No colors. Just matte black armor and faceless helmets. Not soldiers. Erasers. They moved in units of 2, scanning every square meter. One found the ruined drone Julian had planted and called it in. A decoy. Meant to give them false confirmation. They took it, transmitted a code, and began their sweep outward. Julian moved away from the hub, Vex leading through narrow rock corridors marked by erosion and abandoned cables. When they reached the fallback point, Julian set up the signal displacer. It emitted false heat and movement at a randomized interval. When the first drone passed overhead, it diverted toward the dummy. They waited. Then moved again. By nightfall, the silent hunters had split up. It was a mistake. Julian used a frequency jammer, short range, to blind one unit's comms. In that pocket of silence, Vex attacked. Precise. No sound. The body hit the dirt with a dull thud. Julian disabled the locator tag and dumped the transponder into a running river. The tracker would follow false movement miles away. Another followed. Same method. Vex moved faster each time, never killing out of rage, only precision. No wasted motion. They were no longer prey. They were cleaning up the mess left behind. When the last of the sweep team failed to report, the stealth ship rose again, vanishing without engagement. It was protocol: if the retrieval fails, abort. Not worth public exposure. Julian watched the sky until it settled. They had won a battle. But the war remained. Vex sat beside him, eyes fixed forward, unblinking. In its body now lived a memory no one else possessed. Julian whispered, "They'll try again." Vex didn't respond. It simply stood. Ready. Julian activated the contingency plan the moment the stealth ship cleared the horizon. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about permanence. The truth had to survive beyond them. With the backup data embedded in Vex's neuroarchitecture, Julian initiated the final phase of his strategy: distribution through dormant meshnet nodes scattered across the wilderness, old-world tech that still carried ghost signals when powered properly. He had mapped 3 viable transmitters during their journey. Reaching them would mean crossing unstable terrain, but every relay reached exponentially more receivers. If even one signal completed, the Ageron files would become impossible to bury. They traveled light. Julian stripped his gear to essentials: data drives, power cells, decoy markers, and 2 field disruptors. Vex carried a modular uplink kit secured in its harness, hardened against EMP pulses. The creature moved with silent urgency, not from fear but understanding. It knew the difference between running and delivering a final blow. Julian had seen enough to realize Vex's mind operated beyond mere survival. It calculated, adapted, decided. The first meshnet relay sat inside the ruins of a collapsed observatory, buried beneath stone and snow. Julian spent 4 hours reactivating its internal systems. Dust choked the cooling vents, and ancient circuitry sputtered, but power eventually surged. The signal launched cleanly. Packet 1 of 3 dispersed. They didn't wait to see if anyone responded. Time had become a currency they couldn't waste. The second relay sat deeper into volatile terrain, where geothermal pockets turned valleys into boiling traps. Julian's boots melted halfway through the sulfur plains, but Vex navigated the landscape flawlessly, identifying paths that reacted to pressure rather than weight. At the relay, a fractured, half-standing broadcast pillar, they faced interference. Localized jammers pulsed irregularly, which meant someone had deployed tech in anticipation of the upload. Julian rerouted the transmission through analog lines, embedding the data as frequency anomalies across several channels. He masked it in archaic formats, no longer used, almost forgotten. Those listening wouldn't recognize it immediately. But someone eventually would. Second packet transmitted. The third location had once been a defense communications outpost, perched on a cliff edge overlooking dead forests. As they approached, Julian's sensors picked up aerial scans. Smaller this time. Drones, autonomous, no visible operators. A final cleanup operation. Not meant to retrieve, meant to erase. They moved faster, not to outrun them but to stay ahead of their scanning loops. Julian reached the outpost's power core, nearly dead, but functional with a bypass. While Vex stood guard, Julian connected the final data cache, letting the full Agaron project, every note, every log, every image, flow into the relay. The drones descended mid-transfer. Julian initiated the pulse loop, scrambling their targeting systems temporarily. Vex launched upward, intercepting one midair, tearing its rotor core apart before it could stabilize. The other fired blindly, piercing Julian's side. He collapsed, but stayed conscious, gritting through the pain as the transfer reached 98%. He forced the relay into override, burning out its processor but ensuring the data's final burst. Complete. Vex returned, wounded but standing, blood, not its own, dripping from its fur. Julian tried to speak but coughed, spitting red. He looked at his wrist pad. A beacon blinked, signal received, bouncing across micro-relays and decrypted nodes. It was done. Julian pulled a capsule from his belt and handed it to Vex. Inside was a hardened core containing every known record of Agaron. The full archive. Unredacted. He pressed it into the creature's chest and activated the sync. A light blinked green. "Take it north," he rasped. "There's a man, Ames. He used to leak whistleblower files. He'll know what to do." Vex didn't hesitate. It lowered its head, pressed gently to Julian's, and turned toward the ridge. Julian lay back, vision fading. His breath came shallow. But he smiled. Because somewhere beyond the sky, 1,000 dormant receivers now echoed the truth. Vex ran. It crossed dead ground, old borders, surveillance nets. It moved like myth. Observers called it a ghost. Some claimed it was artificial. Others swore it watched over refugee camps, dismantled patrols, and left encoded tags that no AI could break. Wherever it went, the data spread further, through traders, rogue broadcasters, broken satellites. A signal that couldn't be silenced. They had made a weapon. But what survived wasn't their tool. It was a memory. A will. A mind that had learned not just how to kill, but why to fight. And it never stopped running.